I just decided that marketing guru was cultural appropriation. I don't know if you're familiar with this concept, where if you borrow anything from any other country, it's kind of treated as cultural appropriation. White people wearing dreadlocks and so on. And I thought stealing from the subcontinent the title guru and applying it to virtually everybody in business was a bit dodgy. And I'm not from that part of the world, so I thought marketing druid was much more interesting. And I'm also fascinated, by the way, I'll just add a little detail, I'm fascinated by Global Welsh and the idea, because as I was saying earlier, the Welsh diaspora is the worst branded diaspora in the world. And that's possibly because Welsh people assimilate very rapidly anywhere they go. The Scottish people, even people with the most absolutely tenuous connection to Scotland or Ireland in the United States, go on about absolutely nothing else, do they? And people who are kind of 1/16th Irish in the United States on St. Patrick's Day will start wearing ridiculous green clothing and then generally talking bollocks. But the Welsh diaspora in the United States, which includes J.P. Morgan, Thomas Jefferson and Elvis, okay? People are completely unaware of this. If you actually mention it, I actually went on a tour of, funnily enough, I went on a tour of Frank Lloyd Wright's Taliesin, just north of, it's effectively north of Madison in Wisconsin. And he had a great big bust of Jefferson. And it seemed that, Frank Lloyd Wright was obsessed with Jefferson. And I said, well, you realize Jefferson was Welsh. And the person showing us around had no clue. Now, had this been an Irish or Scottish connection, it would have been made absolutely instantly. But the Welsh diaspora, for some reason, either it kind of loses it. In some ways it's good, isn't it? Because you don't want to go to America and find a load of people sort of toting harps and wearing ridiculous costumes. So, maybe it's good news in a way. But it does strike me that there's the opportunity to do something here which is really meaningful by just making a connection which otherwise tends to atrophy much, much faster than it does with other groups which disperse around the world. The other reason that it really appeals to me is the ability to really promote businesses, and in both directions, promoting exports and inward investment. And the reason I became fascinated with behavioral science in marketing is precisely because, unlike advertising, it's a scalable skill. And when I say scalable, you can practice it at the tiniest level, okay? So, a very small, trivial level, my wife occasionally wants me to take the rubbish out. And what this generally means is she waits to a totally inopportune moment. Does anybody know, by the way, there's no point in buying headphones if you're married. Does anybody else notice this? Because headphones, if you're married, create enormous back pain. And that's because the second you put headphones on, your wife will start prodding you on the back in order to ask you a question. But typically my wife will wait until I'm wearing headphones, and then I'm sitting in my underpants or something, and she'll say, can you take the rubbish out? And I point out there's a behavioral science answer to this, which is just to choose a different moment. Don't even say a thing, leave the bag of rubbish by the back door. At the point I hit the back door, I will have shoes on and generally be completely dressed, and I will be heading downstairs anyway. At that point, it would seem an act of perversity not to pick up the rubbish and take it out. So at a very even simpler level, I have a colleague who worked in investment banking for many years, and he said that about 20% of the success in his career he put down to 7 words. Now, a very simple insight, psychological insight from behavioral science is there's the words in a question or a request or a favor, and there's the emotional response. And what determines the behavior, both what people do and the mood in which they do it, isn't determined by the words, it's determined by how they react to them emotionally. And he said a very simple thing. He said nearly everybody, I'm telling you this because it means that no one can go away feeling, well, that was a waste of time, wasn't it, okay? He said typically people will ask a favor, let's say of an underling or some colleague at work, and they'll say, I need you to do me a favor, okay? Or, I'm sorry to dump this thing on you. And there are lots and lots of phrases which all mean the same thing, but they all have a totally different emotional response. So, for example, he said the 7 magic words he always used were, I wonder if you can help me. Now, if you think about it, if you say, I need you to do me a favor, you're essentially dumping someone on someone. Essentially, they immediately undertake that task with a grudging mindset. If you say, I wonder if you can help me, they gain in status by being able to answer yes. So there's an immediate emotional reward to being able to say, well, yes, actually, I might be able to do that. And you can take that up, if I said it's scalable, you can take it up into slightly larger things. One of our early pieces of work was with telephone call centers. And we found repeatedly that you could just change a tiny phrasing or add 7 or 8 words to a call center script. Because I think call center scripts generally tend to be written in a hurry, don't they? And they also tend to be written by people who are completely logical. I'm not stereotyping you, by the way, by talking about call centers. I just want to be clear about that. But what we discovered, for example, is News International, people had to subscribe to newspapers online. And they had to choose between 3 different subscriptions, a mix of kind of digital and analog subscriptions. And a lot of people, it's difficult making a decision over the phone because you haven't got anything to actually look at to make a side-by-side comparison. And you've got to try and remember the features of all 3. If you just added the sentence, most people choose B, the conversion rate and the sales rate doubled. It's kind of magic you can perform. Because one of the things we are instinctively is we're kind of a herd animal. And when in doubt, not irrationally, we basically go, well, what do most other people do? Because that's not going to be terrible. And we even did something which was possibly slightly dodgy, which is a lot of people rang to cancel their online subscriptions to newspapers because they were retiring or moving overseas. And now, actually, if you think about it, the need for an online subscription to a newspaper when you move to France is probably greater than it is when you live in the UK, because you're not going to get hold of it otherwise, and it's going to be 2 days late. So what we actually said is, we said, how can we make it seem the most normal thing in the world to continue to subscribe to a British newspaper when you've emigrated to France? So what we do is we say on the phone, let me put you through to our expats department. And we'd actually hand them off at random to anybody else who happened to be free. But the fact that you had an expat department essentially suggested that, okay, this is a thing. I'm not being a total weirdo by doing this. This is obviously a thing which other people do, and therefore I can feel reasonably comfortable doing it. And so what always fascinated me about this was that there's a kind of, essentially, there's a kind of magic which is possible. Now, I know I'm in the right country to talk about that, but what's increasingly happened is that the world of business and the world of policy making has been taken over by hardcore rationalists. You know, economists, spreadsheet jockeys, people with a very, very strong engineering mentality. And of course, the first rules in physics are no magic. And as Roald Dahl said, well, good local connection there. As Roald Dahl famously said, if you believe in magic, you'll find it. The opposite is also true. That if you don't believe in magic, you'll never perform any. And I think there's a huge problem, because I think all decisions in terms of government policy are made with an eye on what is economic objective rationality, not what would make people feel better. And so I'll give you an example of this. I just suggested about 2 weeks ago, I said, someone called me from one of the Conservative Party campaigns and said, what do you think about tax cuts? And I said, I think they're rubbish. I said, I'm not necessarily against the idea of cutting tax, but after about 2 years, nobody notices anymore because they get used to the new level of taxation. No one punches the air and goes, well, hey, back in 1988, I would be paying far more. No one has that kind of frame of reference. I said, why don't you, if you want to cut tax, why don't you hold the rate of tax constant? And at the end of the year, pay them a rebate. Now, that way you'll actually notice. Okay? But secondly, why don't you try something a bit cleverer? Which is, before you pay them the rebate, say, would you like us to withhold part of this rebate because you can donate it either to charity or to the NHS or to any reasonable cause? Or to the BBC, potentially. Okay? Now, my point about that is it's very, very hard to get people to give money to the NHS. It's much, much easier psychologically to get people to receive less of a windfall. And it would also put people who are always obsessed with putting tax up, it would kind of put them on the spot, wouldn't it? Because you could say, well, did you actually give any of your tax rebate back? And if they said no, you could say, well, the position from which you continually advocate tax increases has become a bit dodgy if you're not really prepared to do it yourself. And so, there's a really, really interesting potential here, which is that you suddenly realize that lots and lots of decisions are passed straight to economists or straight to lawyers, and they never get offered to any magicians, any marketers, any psychologists, anybody in the field where magic is possible, where you can make 1 + 1 = 3, is effectively kept out of the game. And I think there's a huge loss there. There's a fantastic example of this, by the way, which I think I've got a slide on it, but I'll tell you about it now. A guy called Shlomo Benazzi at UCLA, who I know quite well, he looked at how pensions work, and he said, what you basically do is you go to someone who's a bit skint, and you say, well, you're young, you really need to take out a pension, sign up now, and you can pay $250 a month into your pension. And most people go, ooh, no, I don't want to do that. Not least because they will immediately become $250 a month poorer, and they were planning to go to their mate Dave's stag party in 3 weeks' time, and now they won't be able to afford to go. So he said, why don't we just redesign this in psychological terms rather than economic terms? So he said, you go to people and you say, do you want to sign up to a pension? They go, how much will it cost me? And you say, well, nothing to start with. Okay, I'm a bit interested now. And then you choose a percentage. And you're 26, 27, and let's say you choose 20%, okay? You sign up, you commit 20%. First month you pay nothing, second month you pay nothing, third month you pay nothing, fourth month you pay nothing. As soon as you get a pay rise, 20% of the increment automatically goes into the pension. And unless you opt out, that applies to every single pay rise you get for the rest of your life. Now, the interesting thing is that to an economist, there's no difference between getting poorer and getting less richer. But for very, very good evolutionary reasons, humans really distinguish between the two massively. And what you found when you designed a pension like this is, fascinatingly, twice as many people signed up, and the people who did sign up, on average, saved twice as much over just a 7-year period, never mind a 25-year period, as the people who signed up to a conventional pension. Now, when we design chairs, okay, we design chairs not just to support the weight of a human, we design them around the evolved shape of the human buttock and body. Okay. And when we, if you think about it, when we design door handles, we put them at the height that's generally pretty usable by the majority of human beings. Very small children have to reach up, very tall people may have to reach down a bit, but generally the human body is factored in. And yet, strangely, when we design, say, something like a pension program, we don't, or a call center script, we don't design it around the evolved shape of the human brain. And I think as a result, a lot of things designed by economists make perfect sense, but they're mentally uncomfortable. It's exactly like asking people to choose without saying, most people do this. Anybody here from insurance, given that I'm in Cardiff? No, okay. One of the reasons people lie on their insurance forms, and I've said this, is that, okay, I'll come clean on this. I kind of lie on my insurance, car insurance, okay? And the reason is, okay, my car's parked a long way from a public road, behind some gates, okay? And then there's the question, is your car parked, garaged overnight? And I go, well, it isn't really. I have got a garage, but it's full of junk, okay? But I'll say it is, because otherwise I might be paying 300 quid a year, basically. Now, if you made it explicit what the cost of not being garaged overnight was in my postcode, and when I finally came to check out of my insurance, it said, you don't have to garage your car overnight. If you pay 25 quid a year, we can insure you without garaging your car. I go, yep, it's worth 25 quid for the feeling of being honest and having told the truth, okay? That's broadly speaking true. But my deep inner lizard brain is going, shit, telling the truth here might be costing me 500 quid. I have no idea. I have no idea what the cost of honesty is, so I'm actually going to play a bit of a blinder and take the risk, okay? And so, the transparency of insurance, you could redesign the choice architecture of insurance so that everything you get is actually to some degree transparent. And therefore, people are much, much more likely to tell the truth. In a lot of cases, people are kind of lying out of fear of the alternative. They're not lying because they really, really want to lie. And so, understanding this, I think is just really, really interesting because, well, actually, perfect Welsh example. Does anybody know who this is? Yeah, brilliant. Dave Snowden. Has anybody come across him? He worked for IBM. I think he's one of the most interesting thinkers in complexity theory. And he's very proudly Welsh, hence the name of his framework, which I think is pronounced Cynefin. Is that right? Cynefin. Oh, thank you. Second syllable. Now, the interesting thing, that I think means habitat, right? It's the Welsh for kind of habitat or surroundings. And his point is that essentially, the mistakes we often make is we're trying to make everything in business scientific, but we're using the wrong kind of science. Now, there are certain things which are straightforward science, I think. Here we go. This is the way that Dave Snowden, I've met him once actually, fantastic guy. This is the way he divides up the world. There are kind of obvious things, cause and effect, repeatable, known and predictable, best practice. This is what you do here. Probably designing an aircraft would come under that, okay? Broadly speaking, by the way, you don't want wildly creative people designing aircraft. You want people who have a pretty sound grounding in aeronautics. I don't want creative people in air traffic control, to be absolutely honest. Let's try just reversing the runway just for the lols. I don't want that, okay? But then you actually go from complicated to complex to chaos. And the point about that is the rules fundamentally, it's like water, steam, ice. The rules fundamentally change depending on which environment, or I guess Cynefin, is that right, you're actually operating in. And just as the properties of water change according to temperature, essentially what we're often trying to do in business, particularly in anything involving human behavior or human psychology, is we're trying to use Newtonian physics to solve kind of meteorological problems that are hugely complicated. And I think the great thing is, the great problem I think that's happened is that everything in business has become a massive, great arse-covering competition. Now, it's fair to say, I think without arse-covering, we'd all be working a 3-day week. I think if you go and look around your office and ask yourself really cynically, how many of these people are actually contributing to the creation of economic value, and how many of them are essentially performing self-justification activities under the guise of rigor, okay? Right? I think you'll find that it's about 50-50, okay? And it's tragic, actually, because what we have in Britain and in Wales is pretty much a high-trust culture. And when you demand that everything has to be justified to a huge level of kind of bureaucratic detail, what you do is you're creating the inefficiencies of a low-trust culture, where everything has to be, in other words, everything has to be quantified, counted, double-checked, ratified. And the whole point about a high-trust culture is you can, to some extent, trust people to get on with things using their own instinctive judgment and their own tacit skills. And I think by creating this kind of digital bureaucracy, which I think has been massively turbocharged by the invention of the spreadsheet, we've actually created an extraordinary amount of invisible inefficiency. Because it looks as if we're being rigorous and scientific. We're not really being scientific because we're using the wrong kind of science. And the motivation isn't really the creation of value, it's actually the justification of one's existence in the workplace. There's a great concept which you need to know. Gerd Gigerenzer, a German decision scientist, calls it defensive decision making. And if you look at, if you think that's a problem in business, it's a problem in medicine, which is most doctors admit that when they make a decision, a large part of the motivation is essentially, what's the worst that can happen to me, okay? Now, if you think about it, as a doctor, it's much, much easier to get sued for doing nothing than it is for doing something. Because if you do something, you pass someone on to a consultant. This is a bloody problem, right? Okay. So the tendency for over-intervention in medicine is driven by the fact not that actually it's worth doing this operation, but the fact that if anything goes terribly wrong, he might sue me if I do nothing, whereas if I do something, I'm in the clear. And it's a massive distorting factor in a large amount of business decision making as well, where people are essentially going, okay, I'm not really making the best decision here, I'm making the decision that's easiest to defend. And it's a version of no one ever got fired for buying IBM, but practiced on a massive scale, you know, kind of universal scale. And so, just to make a point here about the wrong kind of science. The real world, okay, actually has hugely path dependent, okay? The assumption of most of the kind of maths that goes on to modeling, for example, what businesses do, I think it's also starting to really infect the advertising industry because it's turned into a kind of efficiency game. The point about advertising is it's effective, okay? And all the focus is on trying to eliminate waste without realizing that maybe it's the waste that kind of works. I know that sounds really weird, but I mean, if you want to really, let me just explain that very clearly, okay? If you want a really efficient ad, walk into a pub and put up a sign that says drink beer. Okay? And you can point to how amazingly efficient that is because nearly everybody exposed to the sign is in fact drinking beer. Right? Okay? But actually it's not a very effective ad because most of those people would have been drinking beer anyway. Because by dint of being in a pub. Okay? That's what you tend to do. It tends to treat everything as a first order optimization problem. In other words, we've got to take a metric and we've got to actually essentially make that number bigger or smaller. It assumes there's a single right answer. Now, if you think about it, in all your high school science, everything that you thought of as scientific, chemistry, biology, maths, there was a right answer. A single right answer, typically, to a question. Now, in the real world, there isn't, genuinely. I think it's one of the reasons, actually, why, strangely, you actually need competitive capitalism. Because if there were single right answers, then the government could actually decide what it is. But actually, if you look at business, there are genuinely, you know, there are 10 ways of running a hotel, there are 10 ways of running an airline, and they're different things. They're all right answers to kind of the same question. And so one of the reasons you need competition is that actually the very idea that you can centralize something assumes that there's a single right way to sell groceries, a single right way to rent cars, a single right way to run a taxi firm. And there kind of isn't. Okay? But that's an assumption, again, you know, which comes from misunderstanding what science is. It assumes that the right answer is not affected by context. Now, in psychology, everything's affected by context because we derive meaning not only from what something is, but the context in which it's presented to us. I mean, even, all our senses work contextually. Okay? So I mean, there are wonderful experiments like this where, I don't know if anybody's seen it, where they took one of the world's best violinists, Joshua Bell, and they got him to busk in a kind of tube station in the States. And everybody just walked past. He's a busker, okay? They just assumed he was pretty good for a busker, okay? Similarly, there are wonderful experiments where people take KFC and they go to organic food festivals and present it on a bed of lettuce. And everybody says, marvelous, you can taste the wholesome, you know, essentially everything we taste, everything we smell, everything we see is mediated by context. Now, of course, if you're trying to look for Newtonian physics laws, you try and get context out of it, because the point of a law in physics is that it applies regardless of the circumstances. There are no phase transitions. The idea that objective measurements capture everything, you know, the idea that all the data you need can be expressed in numerical form, whereas actually, you know, if you think about it, okay, Uber, okay, there's a numerical measure for how long you have to wait for your cab. Actually, that's not the most important thing. The great thing with Uber is that it makes waiting much less annoying because you can watch the cab approach on a map. And if you think about it, okay, there isn't a measure for being pissed off. There isn't a numeric measure for where the fuck is my minicab, okay? In the same way that, so we tend to get fixated on the things that happen to be numerically expressible. Loads of other things. It assumes that value is objective, that averages are reliable. Not necessarily true. Averages are often very, very misleading in the real world. It assumes that the opposite of a right answer is wrong. My argument in marketing is, I made this point about more than one right answer. Quite often, in marketing, the opposite of a right answer is another right answer, weirdly. I know that sounds really weird. If you think about it, there are two ways you can check into a hotel. You can make it really, really cool and efficient where it just you walk up with your mobile phone and unlock the door. That's cool. Or you can do the Mandarin Oriental approach where someone walks you up to your room and makes you a cup of tea while you fill in the forms. That's also cool. Okay? The middle probably isn't all that great. I had a very weird experience about the opposite of a right answer being a right answer, which is I went shopping for bedding with my wife, and not necessarily voluntarily. And after looking at bedding for about 25 minutes, I said, "Can I make a deal with you here?" And she said, "What?" She said, "Can we spend one of two amounts of money, please?" And she said, "What are those?" "Nothing or a lot." Now, I think a lot of people understand this, because I said, look, if we spend nothing, I'm quite happy with the bedding we've got at the moment. It's kind of all right, okay? And we'll have saved 200 quid and I can go and buy a drone or something, okay? So, on the other hand, if we spend a lot, I can get nerdily excited by thread counts, mattress toppers, Egyptian cotton, Oxford pillowcases, maybe some sort of foam, strange, duck feathers that are plucked from Canadian geese or whatever. I can get excited if we spend a lot. But I said, you don't get an endorphin rush from mid-market retail, do you? You don't get it, you know what I mean? So I said, in many cases, I think, if you look at retail, I think that's the case where the opposite of a good idea is a good idea. I think they're two brilliant, there are fantastic retailers in TK Maxx is a genius retailer, psychologically, and I also think Bond Street is genius, because actually it gives you a kind of thrill being extravagant. Whereas the middle of retail, the Marks and Spencer's clothing area, is the area nobody wants to be. We all get a bit of a thrill picking up a bargain, and we all get a bit of a thrill from an extravagance, but we don't really get excited by anything mid-market. And so, quite often I think in psychology, all the assumptions, and I think you could add about 5 more, all the assumptions about what a science looks like are kind of wrong. For example, the same thing can have a totally different meaning according to context. So 2 examples of this, Bourdieu, the French anthropologist, pointed out, okay? If you give someone a present, economically, that's an act of generosity. Generally, they like it. But if you return a present, that's not generous, that's an insult, okay? Generally, paying people for things acts as an incentive, but don't try paying your wife for sex, okay? Because that means something completely different, okay? Right? So, depending on context. Now, economists are genuinely baffled about this, because they go, well, if you're prepared to have sex anyway, surely the addition of some money would make it an even more desirable activity. And you go, no, it doesn't work like that, okay? I did try it once as an experiment. Don't do that, okay? So, this is the extraordinary thing, that actually, what you really need in the modern world, I think what you need in what Dave Snowden would call more complex systems, is you need to just flip perspective a lot. It's a great phrase, I think, by Alan Kay, who's a brilliant web designer: change in perspective is worth 80 IQ points. If you think about it, even in advanced science, what Einstein did was effectively a flip in perspective. It was, I think the big question which was decisive was, what would it be like if you rode on a beam of light? In other words, if you saw the world from light's perspective, suddenly the things that were thought to be constant become variable, and the things that were thought to be variable become constant. And I think that's the thing which I think, one of the problems I think of an over-connected world is we tend to see everything from the, essentially a dominant point of view tends to form around things, and everybody shares the same point of view. And so if you think about it, okay, if you had a government problem, you get a bunch of lawyers in and you get a bunch of economists in. You wouldn't get any poets, okay? And actually, people seriously make this point, which is that the problem is that economists will always do the same thing. They'll define the problem in economic terms and try and solve it using economics. And so one of the, I think, the vital things is, to be honest, what you need is a company culture where you can make stupid suggestions and still get promoted. Not all the time, because then you're just an idiot, okay? But if you feel you can't suggest something a bit silly and get away with it, you've got a problem in your company culture. And of course, the worst example of that is the civil service. where fear of Daily Mail, fear of press embarrassment, essentially drives creative thinking down to a total minimum. So I was at the Cabinet Office once, and they said, how do you get people to pay more tax? And I said, the Romans made it work because they made it high status. So if you actually paid a wealth tax, you got your name on a ruddy great pillar in the middle of Rome. And people actually came out of the woodwork and said, I'm much richer than him. Why don't you put my name on the pillar? Right? I said, if you have visible status, if you look at the rich, I mean, Adam Smith said this, okay, the chief enjoyment of riches is the parade of riches. Rich people will spend disproportionately to show off because they're less about utility and more about reputation, in a sense. Okay, so I just said, why don't you just create some perks so that when you pay more tax, you visibly become a higher rate taxpayer, so there's an incentive to pay more. So I said, just throwing off an idea, so maybe higher rate taxpayers should be allowed to drive in the bus lanes. Okay, now okay, just to be clear, I didn't mean that as a serious suggestion. My point was sometimes you've got to climb Mount Scilly to get to the bright sunlit uplands that lie beyond. It was a ridiculous suggestion, but which might lead to more sense. What I didn't expect, I might have expected people to laugh, I might have expected people to say that was silly. No. What you got in the room was sheer sodding terror. Everybody there. That literally their knuckles went white and they were trying to kind of work out a way to get out of the room. I can't understand what's going on because I work in an ad agency where that kind of shit is just routine suggestion. And I realised what it is, of course, it's fear of Daily Mail. Because if that gets into the Daily Mail and the Daily Mail says the government is proposing that higher rate taxpayers should be allowed to drive in the bus lanes, then basically the next 6 months of your career are spent firefighting and dodging blame. And so if you create a world where you can't suggest things which are counterintuitive or whimsical or strange or slightly Pythonesque, okay, I don't think you can make that much imaginative progress. And I think the fear, the defensive decision-making, is becoming a worse and worse problem. It's fine, it's fine to make really dumb suggestions. And the truth of the matter is, okay, what human beings are after, what they're really pursuing is meaning. It's not money, it's not utility, okay? What we've kind of evolved to do is to seek and process meaning in things. We're much more interested in what something means than what it is. Because, returning a present in objective economic terms is great, I mean, there are those, does anybody else buy those Italian panettone cakes where everybody simply passes them on to someone else? Okay, and I always suspect that eventually you'll get yours back. But I mean, if a present's directly returned, it's kind of really insulting. And that's what it means, that's what we care about. And what something means depends, as I said, on the context. So this is a famous little psychological example. Nearly everybody reads that as the cat, not Tai Chut, even though the A and the H are exactly the same character. And in the same way, everybody, I think, reads that as A, B, C, D, E, F, and 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. You could perfectly validly read that as A, 13, C, D, E, F, 10, 11, 12, B, 14. Because they're exactly the same. But within the context, they mean something different. And that leads to an extraordinary, really, really valuable insight if you want to practice alchemy and magic, which is you don't have to change the reality, you can simply change the context. If you want to change perception, if you want to change what people perceive, if you want to change their emotional reaction and therefore their behavior, you don't necessarily have to change what something is, you can just change the story you tell about it, the way you position it, the way you frame it. Simplest example, I was talking about scalable examples. My dad wouldn't get Sky, okay? Now he's 88, he lives in Raglan, okay? Which was also a bit of a TV, like Abergavenny, it was a bit of a TV black hole. You couldn't get Freeview, fairly sure. And Channel 4 was in Welsh, which of course, marvellous in some respects. But if you don't speak any Welsh, it's a bit of a bummer, okay? And so I even offered to pay for it. I said, no, I'll fine, I'll pay for it. No, £17 a month is too much. And I know he's the kind of guy who basically, he just loves factual television. If you can watch sort of, Nazis of the Serengeti or, Sharks of the Third Reich or whatever, he's really, really happy. So I said, look, you'd love this. I couldn't get him to change his mind, even by offering to pay. And eventually I said, well, look, tell you what, it's not really £17 a month, is it? It's 60p a day. And he said, what difference does that make? I said, well, You spend £2 a day on newspapers. So you spend £2 a day on newspapers, spending 60p to get another 150 channels of factual telly doesn't seem all nice. But no, I suppose it doesn't, does it? Okay? Now, I didn't change the price. I just told the story you tell about it. By the way, if you want to know a really important thing, if you pay for something with a contactless credit card, it feels 15% cheaper. You know that? Okay, so the actual perception of how much you've paid is reduced. Don't drop the price of something. Just make it really easy to buy. Okay? Now, if you think about it, I mean, actually, Sky wouldn't have a business if they came around every month and asked for 17 quid in cash. You know, it's only because the payment's automatic. So, I mean, all these things are driven really by context. And you can actually make something that's bad good. Oops. Try again. That's a weird one. Oh, do I need to swipe it? No? Do you want to help? Oh. Now, what's this doing? Anybody want to help? Oh, there we go. Oops, no, back. I'm 18, 17, 16. There we are. No. Back again. Back. Try. That one. Yeah, we'll try that one. Fantastic. Sorry about that. You can even make something that's bad good by telling a different story about it. If you've heard of me before, it's probably that whole joke about the Eurostar and supermodels. Okay? Don't spend 6 billion making the trains faster. Okay? Instead, just spend £1 billion hiring all of the world's top male and female supermodels, get them to walk up and down the Eurostar, handing out free Chateau Petrus to all the passengers. You've saved £5 billion, and people will ask for the trains to be slowed down. Okay? I've got a suggestion on high speed too, and I can't get anybody to fault find with it. I said, look, okay, you want faster travel to Manchester, and you also want high, in other words, less overcrowding, higher utilisation. In other words, you want greater capacity on the network. Those are the two purposes of HS2. I said, I can do that for £500,000 in about 6 months. I said, what do you mean? I said, well, the journey time that matters is end-to-end journey time. It's not the time you spend on the train, right? Now, every time I go to Manchester, I buy an advance ticket, because if you don't, it costs £1 million, okay? And because I'm terrified of missing the train I've booked my advance non-refundable ticket on, I turn up at Euston about 45 minutes early, leaving a margin of error to avoid missing the thing. And then I spend 45 minutes smooching around Burger King, basically. Okay? And I said, all you've got to do is you've got to have an app which just says, okay, I've arrived 45 minutes early. In those 45 minutes, 2 trains, one in 5 minutes, one in 25 minutes, leave for Manchester half empty. Okay? All I want is a button on the app that says, I'm already here, okay? Mr. Beardy Weirdy, okay? And the app says, pay £5 and you can leave on the train, or pay £10, you can leave on the train in 5 minutes and sit in seat J8. If you want to pay £5, you can leave on the train in 25 minutes and sit in seat J27. And I'll go, I'll have that one. Now, I've just reduced my journey time by 40 minutes. If you offer that to everybody, you've also improved capacity, because you should always let people travel on an earlier train if there's availability, because you free up later capacity. You make better load balancing use of the available capacity, okay? It's sort of yield management. Now, I'm not suggesting you shouldn't build high speed 2, but what I'm saying is, why would you build high speed 2 before you've done that? Okay? So there you've got a technological behavioural solution to the problem, which by definition is massively cheaper than an engineering solution, and yet no one seems, I talk to engineers, they go, that's cheating. Well, it's cheating if you're a fucking engineer and you want to build a massive railway. Yeah, I accept that, but it's not really cheating if you solve the problem. And so with this thing, okay, you can simply tell it, you know that business when you arrive at an airport and the engines of the plane sort of wind down and you're still a mile from the terminal. And everybody on the aeroplane has the same thought, which is, oh crap, it's going to be a bus. You know, and you feel a bit shortchanged and cheated. And I've always felt that. I've been flying for years. Every time there's a bus, oh God, they've fobbed us off with a bloody bus. And then one day I land at Gatwick and there's a pilot who's either a psychological genius or just accidentally very clever. And he says something totally different. He says, I've got some bad news and some good news. The bad news is we won't be able to get you an air bridge because there's a plane blocking the gate. But the good news is the bus will take you all the way to passport control, so you won't have far to walk with your carry-on bags. I don't like him anyway. That's weird, because that's always true, isn't it, right? Actually, I'm quite pleased there's a bus. And what he'd done is, he'd made the bus no longer an inconvenience in my mind, but a conveyance. I thought, we've got these heavy bags, I don't have to walk past 300 Toblerone stands just to get out of the bloody airport. Instead, I'll walk straight through passport control to the baggage collection area, and I'm out. Now, next time you're on a plane, just try that. If there's a bus, say very loudly to your companion, you know, not difficult saying loudly because you're Welsh after all. So your natural mode of conversation is shouting, isn't it? You know, let's be honest about this. I have to admit this. I have to occasionally attend school speech days in England. And if there's anything that makes you realise you're of Welsh ancestry, it's attending a very English social event. Fair? Because A, the standard of conversation is appalling, true? Okay, Anglo-Saxon conversation is just rubbish. Okay, literally, I've travelled on trains for 25 years in the southeast of England. I've never overheard an interesting conversation from any Anglo-Saxon person. By contrast, the last time I arrived back in Wales, I stayed upstairs from a pub, and I was going down the stairs, and there was a party drinking at a table beneath me, and I overheard the following exchange, which is, how do you know they've had sex then? Well, I saw in Abergavenny and she was wearing his wellies. Okay. Now, I didn't realise you have some sort of mating ritual around welly sharing, but that was really something. But anyway, the interesting thing is, if you just say very loudly, I'm quite glad there's a bus because it takes you all the way to park. You've just synthesised happiness and value in someone's head, not by changing the reality, but by just changing what they focus on. Okay? And that's one of the most important things of all. What you focus on becomes more important because you're focused on it, and therefore you can turn a weakness into a strength. Okay? That's the simplest trick of advertising, and the most magical thing you can do is turn a weakness into a strength. If you think about it, a lot of the greatest advertising lines have done exactly that. We're number 2, so we try harder, for Avis, right? Now, normally, being number 2, particularly in the United States, means you're not as good as number 1. But if you add the little sentence, so we try harder, you've created a totally new story around it. Similar examples are reassuringly expensive for Stella Artois, okay? There's Fresh Cream Cakes, Naughty But Nice, which was written by Salman Rushdie when he worked at Ogilvy, believe it or not. You have all those little lines like, for example, good things come to those who wait, for Guinness. You either love it or you hate it, for Marmite. And a lot of the greatest advertising lines do that fantastic little thing of taking a negative and flipping it into a positive. Yeah, okay, we haven't got an air bridge, but you don't have to walk down 6 miles of Kafkaesque corridors to get to your baggage. And so that's how alchemy kind of works. It also works, by the way, in the field of price. So whether something's expensive or cheap, just as with my dad, compared to newspapers, Sky TV is quite reasonable. Does anybody here feel guilty buying really expensive tea? Because I always did. Okay, and you get that monkey-picked Formosa oolong, whatever it is, and you look at it and you go, shit, it's 50p a tea bag. This is batshit crazy, right? I can get PG tips for. But think of it this way, okay? If you make that tea with tap water, it's actually cheaper than bottled water. At least you get some sodding tea, okay? So our perception of price is weirdly relativistic. So Rolls-Royce and Maserati stopped selling their cars at car shows because they looked really expensive, okay? And they started selling their cars at yacht shows and aircraft shows. Because if you've been looking at Learjet all afternoon, a €400,000 car is kind of an impulse buy, okay? It's like putting the chocolate next to the till. And in the same way, this thing is a magical money spinner, because if you had to buy an espresso coffee in a jar like Nescafe, it would cost, for an equivalent caffeine dosage, it would be about 40 quid for a jar. And you'd look at it on the shelf and go, who the hell buys that? It's insane, right? But of course, it doesn't come in a jar. And so we don't know what an individual Nescafe costs, I mean, unless you work in procurement. We don't know what an individual filter coffee costs, because we've never done the maths. So when you buy one of those pods, your frame of reference isn't Nescafe, it's not even filter coffee, it's Starbucks. And you think, well, it's 39p for this pod, but that would cost me £2.20 in Starbucks. This machine's making me money, basically. Okay? So, that's the most extraordinary. Now, I've got a very extreme theory, which most of the world's really profitable businesses are as much the product of accidentally or deliberately stumbling on a psychological mind hack as they are the product of, fantastic supply chain management, wonderful, I think that's true of Uber. I think it's weirdly true of Google, actually. In that the extraordinary thing that Google did was everybody else was trying to clutter up their search engine with a portal, with like sports scores, weather, etc. And Google, fair enough, Alta Vista did the same, but Google just had basically a line and 2 buttons. Now there's a human psychological thing called the jack of all trades heuristic, which is we tend to assume that someone who only does one thing is better at it than someone who does lots of things. And so the very simplicity of design of this thing was its huge strength. Now, it didn't arise through intention. It was simply because Larry Page was crap at coding HTML, so that was the most he could actually do. So the extraordinarily appealing simplicity of the Google search page really came about partly by accident. But I think if you'd covered it with crap, I don't think it would have gone anywhere. I think if you cover that page with like sports stories and weather reports, as was the fashion, because it was called a portal back in the kind of 90s, I don't think it would have gone anywhere. And then if we go to, this is the most extraordinary piece of, oops, sorry, wrong way. If we go to the most extraordinary piece of perceptual magic, wrong way again, and again. Sorry, there we are. If you don't believe that a large amount of what's meaning and what's perception is actually produced in the head, not in the objective world of perception, your telly. It only produces 3 colours, and yet your head sees 3 million, or probably 1 billion actually, with some of the more advanced TVs. Now, if you had to produce a TV to be objective and universally accurate as a depiction of real reality for all species, it would cost billions, because you'd have to produce every single colour on the light spectrum, right? You'd have to produce yellow, you'd have to produce magenta, although that doesn't exist in reality, but it's complicated. You'd have to produce ultraviolet for birds, you'd have to produce infrared for snakes, okay? And you'd have to have a pixel for every single possible shade you wanted something to be. And that television would be basically impossible to manufacture. So TV is an extraordinary psychological, alchemical mind hack. And the way it works, all colour mixing actually happens in the mind. Because the human eye contains 3 types of cone. They're relatively sensitized to red, green, blue. Everything else, if you fire, you could have a TV that produced yellow, but there's no point because the brain can't distinguish between yellow and equal amounts of red and green. So why bother producing yellow when you can just produce red and green and get them to fire in equal quantities, okay? Magenta's really weird. That's when you get red and blue but no green. Because the brain goes, well, that's strange, because halfway on the spectrum, halfway between red and blue is actually green, but I can detect green and I'm not actually seeing any. So it invents a colour that doesn't exist in physics just to fill the gap. Okay? I mean, in a more accurate brain, it would go all fuzzy and say system error. Okay? But colour mixing doesn't happen in physics. Okay? If you mix red and green photons, you don't get yellow photons, you get red and green photons. Okay? The reason you can produce a television, and the other thing is televisions are species specific. So they work, when you bought your Samsung telly, it didn't say optimized for higher primates on the packaging. And the reason for that is that dogs don't buy televisions, so it's probably unnecessary to say this. But your dog thinks your TV is crap. Because dogs have 2 types of cone, and they're sensitive to a different kind of the color spectrum. So to your dog, your TV looks like something like a sort of, weird it's a weird representation of reality, where the shapes seem faithful, but the color's terrible, okay? Obviously, parrots and snakes would regard the picture as incredibly washed out because it's completely lacking in ultraviolet. And so the vital truth is that all that matters in terms of how we perceive the world is what we actually detect and what we sense and what we care about, not what actually is. So this is why don't bother producing yellow, because you can achieve the same effect with red and green. And I would say in the same way, I work with British Gas quite a bit, when people get really upset that you can only have a morning or afternoon appointment, I said, well, what do they ask for? And they say, they all want a 1-hour appointment. And why do they want a 1-hour appointment? And that's because they say, well, it's terrible at the moment, because you can just give me a morning and afternoon appointment for the engineer to come, which means I've got to take the whole day off work. Okay? Now, A, I always get a bit cynical because, let's face it, we love taking a day off work. But B, if you think about it, the 1 hour appointment doesn't solve this problem unless you get an appointment at 9 a.m., 8 a.m. or 4 p.m. Because anybody who gets an appointment at noon or 1 p.m. still have to take a day off work unless they live right next to the office. And I said, this is a case where you don't bother producing yellow, you produce red and green, okay? Because it feels the same way. Let me explain what red and green is. If you text people in the morning and saying you're on your way, and you also say, I'll text you when I've finished my last call before you, so you know I'm 30 minutes away, 95% of the anxiety goes away. Because although people were saying, I don't like the duration of my appointment, it would cost millions if you wanted to do 1 hour appointments, because you'd have to have an insane surplus of engineers, because you don't know how long each appointment's going to take, okay? Once you say, basically, look, until you get, you can relax until you get a text saying I'm on my way, you can have a bath, you can go and buy a pint of milk, you can nip next door, you're not under house arrest. Then when you get a text saying I'm actually on my way now, you need to be there and ready and looking out of the window for me to turn up, 90% of the anxiety is removed. So you produce the same emotional effect as having 1 hour appointment windows, but at the cost of a text, not at the cost of millions and millions of pounds. In the same way that you could get a television to produce yellow, but it would cost you a whole ton of money, and what's the point? Okay? So if you can achieve something emotionally, like a television designer, don't bother trying to achieve it in objective reality, because that's expensive. And so there are other fascinating things. A huge amount of what the brain produces when we think we're perceiving things is actually memory. If you've got one of those shower radios or shower Bluetooth speakers, has anybody got one of those? Interestingly, they work really, really well if you're listening to music you've heard before, because your brain basically drowns out the noise of the water and just replaces it with a song. If you're listening to podcasts or totally new music, they're terrible, because you can't hear. So that's an extraordinary thing. I mean, the way in which the brain perceives things is really weird. A wine tastes better if you pour it from a heavier bottle. Painkillers are more effective if they're branded. Painkillers are more effective if they're expensive. They're more effective if you tell people they're expensive. They're more effective if they're red. Chocolate tastes sweeter if you just make the shapes rounder. Okay? So when Cadbury's changed the shape of their chunks from square chunks into rounder chunks, they got bombarded with complaints from people who said you've changed your formulation. And then finally, of course, your car drives better after you've had it cleaned. Have you noticed that? Okay, so it's not just a cleaner car, it's actually quieter, better performing. Everything about that car becomes better when you've cleaned it. And that's because effectively our perception's just really, really leaky and strange. But, as Ludwig von Mises says, this is the Austrian school of economics, who believe that economics should be a subordinate discipline of psychology, and they think that value is not created in the factory, it's created in the head. And the only thing that means that something's valuable is that someone wants to buy it. That's their definition of value. And by this, he explicitly means advertising and marketing, the man who sweeps the floor. There's the food in the restaurant, and there's the person who basically makes the restaurant clean, hygienic, not smelly, no dead rats, no crap on the floor. And his argument is you can't make a sensible distinction between the value created by what you might call the manufacturing process, which is the guy cooking the food, and the guy who actually does the presentation of the thing in an environment in which you can enjoy the food. Because if you had Michelin-starred food served in a restaurant that smelled slightly of sewage, okay, nobody'd enjoy the meal. And so the interesting thing with the Austrians, unlike standard economists, is they think that actually what you might call smoke and mirrors, but you could call marketing, is actually a source of value creation. Now, if you think about conventional economics, the standard economic theory is based on the assumption that everybody is making a decision in conditions of perfect information and perfect trust. Now, if you assume that, you've assumed a world where marketing doesn't need to exist, because everybody knows exactly what something is, how much they're prepared to pay for it, the utility they'll derive from it, and they completely trust the person who's selling it to them. So you wouldn't need any marketing. Now, the result of that is that finance people who tend to be versed in economics instinctively hate marketing, because in their fantasy world of perfect efficiency, it isn't a source of value creation, it's at best a necessary evil. It's a cost to be minimized. Now, the Austrian school of economics would say completely the opposite. They'd say, if you can make something really, really cool by promoting it in an interesting way, you actually create value by doing it, even though the thing itself hasn't changed. I mean, you can make something much more valuable by making it famous, by the way, because we're much more comfortable buying things when they're famous. And it would be completely accepted by an Austrian that fame creation is value creation. So Hayek, Schumpeter, von Mises, these people all believed, they were all kicking, a lot of them were kicking around Vienna at the time of Freud, they all believed essentially that economics and psychology were kind of bedfellows. The standard economic theory doesn't want to believe that. And the trouble with the standard economic theory is, as I said, by modelling it on kind of Newtonian physics, where nothing can be created or destroyed, first law of thermodynamics, or second law of thermodynamics, actually, isn't it? Okay? You create a world with no magic. And the economic equivalent of that is Milton Friedman with "there's no such thing as a free lunch." As all of us know, there is such a thing as a free lunch because we've had some and they're great, right? Patently, you can have a lunch which feels free, which is what matters, right? So, I mean, yes, okay, in totally purist economic terms, someone's paying for it somewhere, but if you can disguise the fact that you're paying for it, you make it more enjoyable, okay? So you've created value. So essentially, you have this weird economic world where efficiency and effectiveness are considered to be the same thing, and where the only way you can improve the world is by making the same thing more cheaply or making the same thing better, not by making the same thing and telling a different story about it or framing it in a different way. And I think it's a huge loss of value. It also, I think, I mean, I'll skip this actually for reasons of time. No, actually, maybe I won't. I mean, maybe, okay, maybe there's a very simple observation about business nowadays, which is there's a winner-takes-all economy, okay? What distinguishes a reasonably good business from a failing business is probably lots of things like managerial quality, cost control, supply chain management, you know, all those things. What distinguishes a good business from a great business, a really, really successful business, I think it's luck. Now, nobody wants to say this because you can't write a Harvard Business Review case going, Google, what a load of jammy bastards, okay? You know, but actually, there is this wonderful guy, Robert Frank, who more or less says, if you look at Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, and I think it's true of Larry Ellison as well, they're all born within about 8 months of each other. And the reason is certainly with Jobs and Gates, okay, if they'd been born 5 years earlier, they would have ended up working for IBM. And if they'd been born 5 years later, they would have missed the whole opportunity to shape history. Gates, if you think about it, extraordinarily lucky guy, went to a school in Seattle, which in the early 70s was leasing time from a nearby mainframe computer. Now, I went to a reasonably well-funded school. We got our first computer in about 1982, and we thought that was amazing, actually having a computer at all. Gates, therefore, had an advantage that only about 0.001% of people on the planet had at the time. But nobody, particularly not Americans, wants to tell a story as if luck plays any part. But maybe part of the value of advertising is just, you just get really lucky. And what can you do to make yourself lucky? Well, probably being famous has much more upsides in terms of luck, like because they've heard of you, some bloke rings you up with an interesting idea, okay? When your chief executive makes a phone call, if your company is famous, people call back, right? If you think about it, the upsides to fame are quite numerous in terms of getting lucky. The downsides, apart from stalkers, aren't that huge. And I noticed this because maybe what you've got to do in the modern business world is genuinely start a good business, make sure it's a good business, and then just make a sod of a lot of noise and hope you get lucky. Now, I know that sounds like a really weird strategy, but if you say, I just published this book, okay, and now if you'd said, how do you promote a book about marketing and psychology and behavioral science? We all would have sat down, talked about business events. We might have mentioned the Hay Festival, okay? We might have talked about a few suitable places to market the book. Suddenly what happens is something freaky happens, which is a friend of Chris Evans gives him the book. He likes the book. I get invited onto the Virgin Breakfast show when he's down in Cannes. The following day he talks about the book on the Virgin Breakfast show. Suddenly I go from number 398 in Amazon to outselling The Hungry Little Caterpillar. Okay, for 2 days I outsold the highway code, and that's compulsory, right? And no one would have planned this, okay? It's the sort of shit that happens. All I need to do now next is to get the book read by someone who knows Oprah, okay, and I can retire. But is it possible that genuinely, because everybody in business pretends that it's all deterministic and that it's all knowable, it's all forecastable, and it's all about prediction, no one's ever considered a view of business which basically says, I don't know what's going to happen in the future. All I can do is do something that makes sense. If I make a load of noise about it, the chance that something amazingly good happens is much higher. And that genuinely there's no actual this is a probabilistic decision. It's not an absolutely deterministic one. You can't guarantee success. You just go, if you make a hell of a lot of noise, you're more likely to get lucky. Now, it's actually, Nassim Taleb, by the way, more or less has a philosophy around this. He says, essentially the trick is to stay alive long enough to maximize the chance of stumbling onto ontological benefits. I think that's the phrase. But nobody's ever going to write a business plan that says this. There was one person who brought in the most successful KGB defector, was a guy who worked for MI6, and he was always getting into massive trouble because they say, what's your strategy? What's your strategy? You need to have a strategy for how you approach people in the KGB. And he finally brought in, not Matrokin, who was the other guy? Oleg Gordievsky, is that right? Okay. And he said, my strategy is always the same. He said, I turn up, I make it abundantly obvious that I work for MI6. I go to a lot of parties, and then I wait to see what happens. And everybody said, you can't do that. That's ridiculous. That's not a strategy. But of course, when Oleg Gordievsky gets pissed off because he's turned over for a bloody promotion, who does he go and see? This guy. So in a sense, you see, it's really interesting because everybody in business is trying to make it like Newtonian physics, where everything has a purpose. In a designed world, everything has a direct and immediate purpose and function. And maybe a large part of what we should be doing is just maximizing the chance of luck. Now, it's not a guaranteed success story. I mean, the book would have done okay without this, but actually, simply being noisy enough so that good things might happen to you. I think just understanding the value of this is really, it's just a new way of looking at things, particularly for B2B brands. If you look at, funnily enough, if you look at most companies, really successful companies, they're the result of 2 or 3 things that just happen to go right. None of which, in many cases, could be planned. Do you remember that? There's an extraordinary rich guy in the West Country somewhere who owns I think he owns the biggest chain of something like Toyota dealerships. And the guy from Toyota happened to land and needed someone to distribute his cars. And this guy had a single car transporter that happened to be parked outside this office. And he gets this call from this Japanese guy who goes, how many car transporters do you have? Because I'm from Toyota and we need some major thing. And immediately the guy goes, well, I can't say 1. So he goes, 20, okay, right. And he goes, right, we need you to talk. The entire thing, if he'd parked anywhere else, the guy would have led his life in obscurity. And so being visible enough, I know the guy from Box.com in the States, who's now worth probably about $1 billion. I met him. And it was entirely because someone got him on breakfast TV. He said he was there basically packing bog rolls in his garage until he freakishly got onto breakfast TV. And then the whole thing went totally ballistic. And so anyway, I mean, the luck thing, make a strength out of a weakness, the Save More Tomorrow pension, design things for the brain, don't design things for economists' brains because they're weird, okay? Also, see if you can just flick things. So one of the things I've always noticed about humans is that if you give them an upside and a bad side, like the good news is, the bad news is, they tend to focus on the good news and they make themselves happy. And so I said, what about a psychological solution to train overcrowding, right? And I asked the question, why don't people like standing up on trains? Now, I'm not talking about 2-hour journeys, I'm not talking about 4-hour journeys, I'm talking about commuter trains. And the reason is that, if you think about it, there could be many reasons. It could be that it's tiring. It could be that you feel ripped off because you paid for a seat and you haven't got one. It could be because when you stand up, you've got to hold on to something, which means you can't read a book, you can't use your mobile phone, you can't look at a tablet. It could be that when you stand up, you've got to spend a lot of your concentration not falling over, okay? And that's just tiring. We don't know. But it's interesting, isn't it? We assume that train overcrowding is an irredeemable bad without asking the question, why is it bad? And I just asked a very interesting question, which is I said, what if you could make the difference between standing and sitting a bit of a kind of, trade-off? So at the moment, if you get a seat on a train, you get a view out of the window, you get a table, you get a place to put your coffee, you get a plug, you get a chair, and you get a place to put your bag where you're not worried about anybody treading on it. You get the lot, basically. If you stand, you get sod all. You get no view, you get nowhere to put your laptop, you can't use one of your arms, so you're effectively half disabled because you're holding onto a post. You've got nowhere to put a cup of coffee, your bag keeps getting trampled on, okay? What if I said you made it a bit 50-50? So you put the seats in the middle of the train, okay, and all you get is a seat, no table, you just get a seat, maybe a cup holder. And then all along the edge of the train, you have loads of bum rests that people can lean against, where you also get a little tablet platform, 2 USB chargers, and a hook underneath the table so you can hang your bag. Suddenly, standing versus sittings become a choice rather than a compromise. And I think lots of younger people under those circumstances will happily choose to stand, thereby freeing the seats for elderly, portly advertising executives who really need them. But I mean, the interesting thing is, everybody's thought of designing that as either perfection or shit, is the way a train's designed. If you designed a train so it was, well, on the one hand, on the other hand, fresh cream cakes, naughty but nice, we'd probably enjoy both circumstances. It's called adaptive preference formation. Aesop and the Fox and the Grapes is the perfect example. Because you'd actually be standing up going, well, I don't really want a seat anyway because I wouldn't be able to use my laptop, okay? If you can tell yourself a story in which you've come out well, you're happy. Basically, that's how it works. And so if you design the world so people can tell those stories, things are much happier. Now, I better speed up. How long have I got? No time at all, really. Very quickly, I always regard marketing as the science of knowing what economists are wrong about. And there are loads of things. This is my wash basin, okay? The reason I haven't repaired the wash basin in the bed is not economic. It's not because it costs a couple of £100, okay? If there were a contactless thing which said repair and replace wash basin, £200, beep, I would have done it the day it cracked. The reason you don't do this is because of a whole load of complex factors like I've got to be at home when a plumber's available and I've got to liaise with my wife about the taps, okay? Then I've got to discuss what kind of wash basin it is. Then it devolves into a conversation about, well, maybe we should use this as an excuse to get the whole bathroom done, okay? But what I'm saying, it's not about economics. And there are loads and loads of behavioral things which are nothing to do with logic or reason. In many cases, by the way, I have a particular animus against dry toilet paper. Because if you think about it, the West is the only, what calls itself the developed world is the only part of the world where it's acceptable to clean your rectum with dry paper and nothing else, right? In the Muslim world, you have a hose. In Japan, you have lavatories that play tunes and squirt water at your bum, okay? In nearly all the rest of the world. Now, you wouldn't go out into the garden and pot a plant, would you, and get a bit of mud on your hands and come, oh, I've got mud on my hands. Let me rub them very vigorously with some dry paper. But for some reason, when it comes to your anus, now what we said to Kimberly Clark is actually, it's simply because if you go to a shop, there are 90 rolls of dry paper on sale, and there are only 2 things of moist paper, and they're all on the top shelf, and they're blue and white, and it looks like it's basically, well, this is just for perverts and people with a medical condition, okay? What we said you've got to do is you've got to produce loads of scented variants, and you've got to have a whole shelf to yourself, so it makes this look like a mainstream thing. Now, just to be clear, I'm not the only person who thinks this, because the producer of Deadpool 2, here we go.
What the big lie is toilet paper. What's the matter about toilet paper? Gets the job done. Does it? Really? Get the job done? All right. Say you wake up tomorrow morning. Hypothetically, find some fresh shit on your face, your cheek, maybe a little bit in the beard. The hell, I'm about to be. Well, what do you do? What do you do? Do you go to the bathroom and tear off a piece of dry tissue and rub it around on your beard a little bit? Go on, get on with your day, go to church, maybe dinner and a movie like nothing happened. All of a sudden did happen, your face smells like shit. Right? So what you do is you put some soap, you get some hot water, and you would scrub the fucking shit out of your beard for like 10 straight minutes. Are you trying not to scrub it enough?
Makes me feel disgusting. I'm starting to feel.
Toilet paper is plenty fine appetizer. But then, hubby has to fill it up. That's your name. They're soft, they're moist. They're for babies. Finally, one more pass with toilet paper. Maybe clear out that excess moisture. Maybe treat yourself to a blower girl if you can get you a hair dryer. Just about 30 seconds and do you good.
Now, does anybody recognise, by the way, who that guy is on the left? It's Matt Damon. The guy who made the film is so obsessed with moist toilet paper that he got Matt Damon in simply to dress him up in prosthetics and deliver a monologue about moist toilet paper before getting killed. Okay? That's how much he cares. Now, video conferencing fascinates me. What would happen, and I actually asked Zoom this, I said, is anybody else a fan of Zoom as a video? Yeah, fantastic. Okay. What would happen, I asked Zoom, what would you charge to give everybody in Wales or everybody in Britain Zoom membership? Now, it sounds like a weird question, but if it's okay for the government to build roads, why is it not okay for the government to provide software? Okay? Because, which then means you don't need roads. And that, you know, that's the kind of thing, but I mean, I'm totally fascinated by the fact that we have this magical technology and people are really, really reluctant to use it. And that's not an economic, there's nothing economic about that because the economic logic would suggest we'd be using this all the time. My worry is that actually, that anything that makes you more efficient at work also risks making you look lazy. And so people don't do it because it looks easy. It is easy, by the way. I have a good tip, by the way. Got a really early video conferencing call. Cardigan. Cardigan over your pajamas, basically you can get away with it, okay? I just thought I'd let you know that. But the fact is, it's an extraordinarily magical productivity enhancing thing which would massively increase global trade, I think, increase global trust. Now, it would be accompanied with some air travel. But the potential it offers seems to me, there should be whole magazines called Video Conferencing World, and there aren't. And I don't understand why that is, because one of the other reasons psychologically, we don't realize how shit email is. Okay, you know how it is when you go at 30 miles an hour on a boat, and it's, you know, what is that, 25 knots? 25 knots in a boat's really exciting, isn't it? You go, woo, wee, we go. Okay, you don't do that in a car, right? Unless you're a Labrador with your head stuck out of the back, okay? Now, I think what it is when we're typing email, we think, ooh, I'm typing quite fast. What we're not conscious of is how insanely, abominably slow it is compared to talking. If you had a face-to-face meeting where people spoke at the speed they typed, you'd punch them in the face. Basically, hello, it's very good to delete, to see you today. And then you'd wait 3 hours and they go, yes, it's great to be here, right? It'd be impossible. But because we think, gosh, I'm typing fast, therefore I'm productive. You're being about 10% as productive as you would be on one of these. And yet where they're going tap, 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 path dependency is a big thing as well, okay? One of the things I've suggested to Zoom is a button in every email that goes to between 2 and 20 people, where there's a button that says, let's turn this into a video conference. Because otherwise, once you end up in email, you get stuck there. There's no escape. So there's a very, very heavy path dependency in the mode of communication you use. Because once you're in email, you can click reply to all really easily, whereas contacting 20 people separately through any other mode of communication is almost impossible. Sorry, do you need more? 5 minutes, is it? Okay, no problem. Okay, right, I'll be even quicker than that, I hope. Another lovely psychological problem, we're designing workwear. Kimberly Clark came to us about the moist toilet paper problem and then said, actually, we've got a bigger problem, which is factory safety. And the trouble is that when people put on protective workwear, they feel invulnerable and they start doing dangerous things. And since Kimberly Clark operate a lot of sawmills, you don't want people feeling invulnerable. Now, one solution would be to make everybody work naked, because you'd sure as hell pay a lot of attention to a circular saw if you didn't have any clothes on. Okay, but that's probably not an adequate solution. What we found is that if you put bones or hands on the back of gloves, pictures, doesn't have any effect on people's fear of a whizzing disc. but they're pretty frightened of that anyway, okay? With a saw or a Stanley knife, the level of perceived vulnerability goes up by 20 or 40% just by painting that thing on. This is what I love, because the trouble with advertising is you can only solve problems for people who have an advertising budget. And I keep arguing, look, there are loads and loads of people with problems which can be solved through creativity and through human insight who don't have an advertising budget, nor do they need to advertise. What they need is a design solution, a psychological solution, just a rethought solution. And so the fact that you can do this at any scale just delights me. Now, I'll just end very quickly. I think I'm going to skip this. No, actually I won't. Very quickly. One very important thing is what humans are trying to do is not what economists think they're trying to do. In making any decision, we're really asking two questions. What's the likely outcome of this decision, and what's the worst that can happen? Because in survival terms, in evolutionary terms, we've got to ask both questions. We've got to ask what's the expectation value of a decision, but we've got to ask what's the variance. And we'll pay a premium for low variance outcomes as well as for better outcomes. Does that make sense? So, I mean, my argument is that this makes sense then of why brands are popular. McDonald's isn't the most successful restaurant in the world because it's very, very good. It's the most successful restaurant in the world because it's very, very good at not being terrible, okay? You're more likely, actually, to have an appalling experience at a Michelin-style restaurant than you are at McDonald's. Now, don't take people there to McDonald's for a date. That's what Nando's is for, obviously, okay? It's not a special occasion, but the absence of terribleness is what we're actually looking for in that brand. And in evolutionary terms, if you think about it, all of you are descended from, every single ancestor of yours was risk-averse enough to stay alive long enough to reproduce at least once. Okay, so the avoidance of terrible is more important in our unconscious psychology than the attainment of perfect. And my argument is that's why brands exist. The main reason we're paying a premium for brands is because when you buy a Samsung something or other, it may not, probably won't be the best thing you could possibly buy, but it certainly won't be awful. And it's only when you understand that we're actually looking at two things when we make a decision, not one. When we ask to describe a decision, we say, I'm trying to buy the best television I can. Unconsciously, though, we look at a television from someone we've never heard of, and we experience fear. And what the fear is not the fear that it, that it might be slightly less good, it's the fear that it might be terrible. And I think that has enormous implications. Humans practice lots and lots of behaviors, including copying other humans, herd behavior. If you copy lots of other people, you may not make the best decision in the world, but it won't be catastrophic. Okay? Now, sometimes this is a good thing. Sometimes in business decision making, it's a terrible thing because everybody just copies best practice and no one even thinks about it because you don't get into any trouble. And I'll skip this very quickly and I'll just very quickly end on, I think, a perfect film to end on. What I was effectively saying is that a bad thing can be made good by changing the story about it. If you think of a bus to the airport as an inconvenience, it's just an annoyance. If you think of it as a conveyance that gets you to passport control faster, suddenly it's welcome. If you think about it, some of the world's most interesting businesses have had to do that in their lifetime. So Cunard is a really interesting case. All those transatlantic liners competed for speed. They were trying to win the blue ribbon. And it was all about whether you could cross the Atlantic in 4.5 days or 4 1/4 or 4 3/4. And they all obsessed about speed. And then jet aircraft came along. And suddenly it was completely irrelevant. Who cared whether you could do it in 4.5 days or 5? Now what Cunard did is they said, okay, we've got to turn a weakness into a strength. We've got to turn the fact that it's a 5-day crossing from being worse than a plane to more fun than a plane. In the process, Cunard kind of invented the world's cruise ship industry. Most of the innovations, like cabins with balconies, were pioneered first by them. And that's what I mean. Nobody ever complains that a cruise ship's too slow. Okay? Because you've got someone to focus on something totally different, which is actually, since I'm enjoying the journey, who cares? I argue this with train travel. I think the invention of Wi-Fi and tables means that we should obsess a lot less about the speed of trains. I jokingly said, by the way, with high speed too, that look, to be absolutely honest, I always accept an invitation to a meeting in Manchester. And they say, well, why are you going to this meeting? It's an actuarial conference. What relevance is that? And I go, I know, but I said, the 3.5 hours on the train in each direction, that's the most productive I'm going to be all week, right? And the hysterical thing with high speed 2 is reducing your time on the train to Manchester. Now, the most likely thing with me is the time I spend 2 hours 10 getting to Manchester is fantastic. I get down to email inbox 0, I get loads and loads of work done, I get to focus on things I can't focus on. It's the meeting that's a total waste of time, okay? And so failing to understand that actually, the really interesting definition that real innovation happens when consumers' metrics of what's important in a category change. That's the real crux of innovation, when people go, just as in digital cameras, okay, it's not about megapixels anymore. It's very interesting, you know, suddenly if you look at the hi-fi category and how the iPod totally disrupted it. You know, I used to have friends who'd spend like, you know, $3,000 on a pair of speakers and go, you know, the cables are hand-woven by Bavarian elves out of pure gold, okay? And then the iPod came along and suddenly nobody gave a shit, did they? I've got loads of songs in my pocket, okay? That's the real disruptive innovation. It's when consumers change what they think of what's important. And if your product can do that, it's really disruptive. But the most brilliant thing to remember is you can turn one product, by changing the way something's described, you can make an indifferent product seem brilliant. Weirdly, by marketing something badly, and we forget this because we talk about added value. I don't like this, because that suggests it's an optional extra. See, if you market a great product badly, nobody wants it. And if you don't believe this, I'll end with this final film, which I always wanted to do an experiment where someone took a brilliant product and just failed to sell it. I thought, you know, it'd be a really, but who's going to do that? I mean, you know. And then 2 Melbourne comedians did exactly that. Here we go. Oh, are we there? Yeah, one more click. No? Sorry. There we are.
Hello, hi. E-books, they have a pretty bad name. Normally associated with lewd content, but by definition, they don't have to be.
So in an attempt to change that, we took one of the world's biggest performing artists, kept all his clothes on, and set up an Ed Sheeran peep show. Would anyone dare to believe what was written outside and come in to our very dodgy looking venue? Okay.
I really know what's going on.
That was fair enough, because we dressed Hamish as a fairly shady-looking spruiker in charge of getting customers.
I got the Sheeran. Who wasn't Sheeran?
Oh, I can hear Hamish.
Do you think I should?
I don't think we'll. It's going to be a brave soul.
I would come in sort of, if there was a dude with a beard and a hat and say like competencies.
It was right. This was going to be tough.
Keep it Ed Sheeran for $2. Insurance. Do you want to keep it Ed Sheeran? Yours. What do you reckon, big fella? Ed Sheeran in here, beautiful ginger hair with him. Sitting on a stool. What do you reckon? $2. Got Ed Sheeran just sitting on a stool in there. You want him? $2. $2 for a beat. Think about it. It's actually pretty good value.
Despite trying, we had a total lack of interest for over 50 minutes. It's been some time. We should have got you a more comfy chair, I think.
Yeah, I'm alright.
Every fella got a Sheeran in there, $2. Or the Ed Sheeran in there. Ed Sheeran. Is it a singer? Yeah? Is that a yes? No? I think one of the big problems is people think Ed Sheeran's a code word for a new drug. $2 for 30-second beat.
What, like, are they just saying no?
Yeah.
That's good.
Dirt cheap, Pete. Dirt cheap, Pete. There we go, $2.
You're definitely pricing too high, and that's why we're not getting it.
Pretty fair.
There we go, boys. It's a Friday. Sheeran peep show for $2. Sitting on a stool, playing a song.
If someone actually does think it's a peep show, I might quickly give you the go ahead to take it for your clothes. You're willing to do that?
Been drinking a lot of beer recently.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
You know
A couple of months ago maybe, but
Yeah.
you know, I'm in shape. It's just the shape of a potato.
it. 2 hours in, and Hamish is getting more desperate.
Ed Sheeran is literally sitting in there on the stage waiting for your $2.
We were feeling it as well, but just when we thought this had been a giant waste of everyone's time.
Sheeran. You love Ed Sheeran? $2? Peep show. Just got him sitting on stage there. Oh, $2. Gonna cost you $2. You only get 30 seconds, though. You okay? Mate? Well, I don't know what I find out. Here we go. Ed Sheeran peep show. He's there to read that. Alright, your choice.
you did the smart thing and walk away.
Listen, I'm just saying, if you got a man to go, he's sitting here by himself and probably get busy later on. 2 months, 30 seconds. I mean, you both can come if you want. Just 2 months ahead.
Forward, I can assure you.
No, absolutely not. I can't guarantee what it'll do, but yeah. But 2 months.
And after 2 hours and 23 minutes, including some final hesitation, we finally found people brave enough to take a lead.
Did you guys go to the pitch over hot or? No. Keep your clothes on style, see? Behave yourselves. Just listen to the announcement. Have a good one. Enjoy your meet.
Hello and welcome to the Peep Show. Your time will start in 5 seconds.
I'm thinking about how people fall in love.
Now, 2 things. One, if that seems fanciful, that's pretty much the position the financial services industry is in. Okay? If nobody trusts you, doesn't matter how good your product is, no one's going to buy it at any price. Second thought, I think, is that, interestingly, if you placed an ad in the Melbourne Age, you know, in other words, something visibly expensive as a mark of I'm not bullshitting, okay, you could have charged literally $200 a head and you would have had a queue around the block. Okay, if you just advertised that in a way that suggested you were actually serious. One of the reasons of advertising is important is simply that the very fact that you're prepared to commit money to it is evidence of confidence in your own product. Okay? And the final thing, though, is that I don't think this has to be expensive. And I'll end on this because I think it's a brilliant example of alchemy with no budget at all, which is when they reopened the St Pancras station after it had been derelict. Freud Communications sent out, if anybody was in London at the time, you'll remember the phrase. They sent out PR releases about the new station, all of which happened to include the sentence, which is, in a sense, the stupidest superlative I've ever heard, which is that it had the longest champagne bar in Europe. Do you remember that? Okay. Now, that's, you know, I've got a weird superlative claim, which is my grandparents were the 4th family in Wales to have a dishwasher. Okay. Okay, right. It's about as rubbish as that. Now, no one ever goes, I went to a champagne bar last night, did you? How long was it? Okay. Right? No, it's a totally, but it's stuck in the mind, and that single thing changed the perception of the station from being a boring station which is all about the efficient throughput of passengers to the fact that the station was a destination in its own right and actually a place worth going to even if you didn't have to catch a train. And so sometimes the reason I started with the talk about scalability and I end with the talk about scalability, the magic of this stuff is you can practice it with a very, very large budget. Okay, we're number 2, so we try harder. You can also practice it at a really, really small scale. Because just occasionally, if you hit the right emotional note, if something tiny, noticeable, it's almost memorable, that sentence, because it's so stupid, okay? But it changes the way you think about something, and that changes what the thing is. And that's me. Thank you very much indeed.